In the Middle Ages, a raised drawbridge was the difference between life and death. Behind it stood walls of stone, towers packed with archers, trapdoor balconies loaded with boiling oil and burning pitch, ready to drop their weight on anyone foolish enough to charge. Armies could sit outside a fortress for months, hammering at walls they couldn't breach, starving out defenders who refused to yield. Entire campaigns ended in humiliation at the foot of a castle that simply would not open its doors. But every fortress, no matter how strong, had one vulnerability, one narrow point where the outside world was allowed in. The drawbridge, the gate, the single moment when a guard had to decide whether to let someone through. And if a man was clever enough, that single moment was all he needed. These are three stories of men who understood that principle perfectly. A monk who wasn't a monk, a woodcutter who carried a sword, and a sack of walnuts that conquered a city. The monk on the rock. It was already deep into the night on January 8th, 1297. On a steep, rocky slope along the Mediterranean coast, a figure moved slowly upward through the darkness. He wore the long dark robe of a Franciscan monk. He leaned heavily on a tall staff that struck the ground with each labored step, as though every meter cost him enormous effort. His face was hidden beneath a wide hood, and what little could be seen was a thick, unkempt beard. He looked exhausted. He looked harmless. Above him, barely visible against the ashen winter sky, the crenellated towers of a fortress clung to the edge of a massive rocky spur. This was one of the most strategically valuable positions on the entire Mediterranean coast, a citadel overlooking a deep, sheltered gulf where ships could anchor safely. The Phoenicians had coveted this rock, the Greeks after them, then the Romans. And for the last 80 years, the Genoese had held it, having built their fortress here in 1215 as a stopover for their long maritime expeditions. The monk slipped and stumbled on loose stones that clattered down the slope behind him. He made no effort to be silent. The guards on the tower above certainly heard him. A lone traveler, moving slowly, approaching the walls in the middle of the night. When he finally reached the massive wooden door at the base of the fortress, its thick iron hinges and enormous nails looming above him in the torchlight, the monk raised his voice and pounded on the panels. "I am a son of Saint Francis. I am on my way to Rome. I ask you for shelter for this night." It was a reasonable request. Turning away a pilgrim, especially a member of a holy order, was not something a garrison did lightly. The guards reported to their officer. The officer gave the order. The gate opened. The monk stepped through, and in that instant, the exhausted pilgrim vanished. The stooped posture straightened. The staff clattered to the ground. The long robe was torn away, revealing armor underneath, and in the Franciscan's hand appeared a long blade whose cold steel caught the flicker of the torches. The nearest guard never understood what happened. He was dead before he hit the ground. In the same breath, roughly 30 soldiers, who had been crouching in the shadows along the outer wall since sunset, charged through the open gate, swords drawn, moving fast. The sentries of the Genoese garrison were cut down before they could organize a defense. The false monk carved a path through the chaos, striking with edge and point, and within minutes, the few surviving Genoese surrendered to a fight that had already been lost the moment the door swung open. The man in the monk's robes was Francesco Grimaldi, known to history as Francis the Malicious, and the fortress he had just taken was Monaco. The Grimaldi family rules there to this day, and the coat of arms of the principality still bears the image of two armed monks flanking a shield. Because the word Monaco comes from the Italian for monk, the name of the nation itself is a monument to the night a Grimaldi dressed as a friar and walked through the front door. The false woodcutters. Bertrand du Guesclin was nothing like the quiet, shuffling monk of Monaco. He was loud, fierce, and physically imposing. A young Breton nobleman who looked more like a brigand than a knight, always ready for a fight, always calculating, always hungry for the next victory. In 1350, during the brutal war of the Breton succession, du Guesclin had gathered around himself a band of men who were, by any honest assessment, thieves and vagabonds. They fought for Charles de Blois against Jean de Montfort and his English allies, roaming the Breton countryside, ambushing supply columns, and relieving the enemy of anything valuable they could carry. Word reached du Guesclin that Montfort had placed an Englishman named Robert Bembereau in command of the castle of Grand-Fougeray, near Redon. The promise of loot and a good fight was enough. Du Guesclin led his band through the forest until the castle came into view. One look told him everything he needed to know. A direct assault was impossible. His 60 men had nothing but bladed weapons, no siege equipment, no battering rams, no way to cross the water-filled moat or force the reinforced gate under a rain of English arrows. Du Guesclin set up camp in the forest, half a league from the castle, and watched. Days passed. His men grew restless. The dreams of banquets and riches that had drawn them here began to curdle into resentment. Grumbling turned to open protest. Had their leader dragged them into the woods for nothing? Were they going to sit here and starve while the English stayed warm behind their walls? Du Guesclin heard the complaints. He understood the frustration, but with 60 men and no siege weapons, he saw no path forward. Then his sentries dragged in a prisoner, a valet from the castle, and the valet talked. Most of the English garrison, he said, had left days ago to intercept Charles de Blois. Bembereau had kept only about 100 soldiers behind. Worse, the English were running low on food and firewood. They were effectively besieging themselves, afraid of a surprise attack they couldn't see coming, rationing supplies in a fortress that was growing colder and hungrier by the day. Du Guesclin saw his opening. He gathered his men and spoke to them plainly. 60 well-armed men against a weakened, isolated garrison. If they acted together, every man among them would earn a knighthood. Charles de Blois would shower them with rewards. Today, he told them, I intend to dine inside that fortress, and I will offer you a fat sheep to eat. The plan was simple and audacious. Half his men would disguise themselves as woodcutters. They would hide their helmets and breastplates under peasant clothes, collect axes and hatchets from the nearby village, and bundle their swords, daggers, and rapiers inside loads of firewood. The other 30 would hide as close to the castle as possible, waiting for the signal. The English, cold and desperate for fuel, would see a group of local woodcutters approaching with exactly what they needed. Why would they be suspicious? The false woodcutters set out, bent under the weight of kindling and logs, their faces half hidden behind the branches they carried on their backs. Du Guesclin strode at the front, barely able to contain his impatience, his long legs eating up the ground between the forest and the drawbridge. The English sentry looked down from the gatehouse. Peasants, woodcutters, the very thing the garrison needed most. He raised his horn, blew the signal, and the drawbridge came down. Du Guesclin was the first across. The moment his feet hit the planks on the far side, he upended his bundles directly into the drawbridge mechanism, jamming it, making it impossible for the English to raise the bridge again. The sentry saw the blade too late. Here is wood to heat your bath, Du Guesclin bellowed, which will be one of blood. At his shout, the hidden soldiers erupted from their positions and charged across the bridge. The false woodcutters threw off their loads, drew the weapons hidden inside, and the courtyard of Grand-Fougeray became a slaughterhouse. English soldiers, alerted by the screaming, poured out from every direction, but they were outnumbered by surprise, outmatched by fury. Du Guesclin himself fought until his face was so drenched in blood he could barely see. At one point, cornered by several Englishmen in a stable, he was moments from being overwhelmed when reinforcements from Blois' knights arrived and turned the tide. The castle fell. The English garrison was destroyed. The audacity of this raid made Du Guesclin famous across Brittany and beyond. Charles de Blois, hearing the story, remarked to his men that he would gladly meet this young fighter and reward him richly, if he could only keep him in one place: the Walnuts of Amiens. More than 2 centuries later, the weapons had changed, the uniforms were different, and the wars had shifted, but the drawbridge remained the key, and the principle du Guesclin had understood so well was still just as potent. If you cannot force a gate open, find a way to keep it from closing. It was 1597. Charles V had bequeathed the Spanish Netherlands to the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs, a vast territory stretching from the coast to the interior. During the French Wars of Religion, Spain had attacked France in 1595, and now, 2 years later, Spanish troops stood within striking distance of Amiens. The city was formidable, high walls of dark stone, black fortified towers bristling with watchposts, an unbroken line of battlements along the parapets, with armed patrols circling day and night, pikes raised. Behind every narrow window, a sentry could be lurking. At the top of every tower, guards scanned the horizon. But Amiens was not technically under siege. Life continued. Every day, peasants from the surrounding countryside crossed the drawbridge with carts loaded with provisions: barrels, chickens, ducks, fodder, sacks of grain. The guards at the bridge inspected everything. They opened sacks. They thrust swords into bales. 2 additional soldiers stood between the walls, ready to trigger the mechanism that would raise the bridge at the first sign of danger. The Spanish commander, Hernando Tello Portocarrero, had been ordered to take Amiens. He studied the defenses and understood immediately that a direct assault would fail. A formal siege would take too long and risk relief forces arriving. The only option was deception. His soldiers gathered every cart they could find in the surrounding villages. They loaded them with goods and dressed themselves as peasants. Then they joined the morning procession of farmers heading toward the main gate of Amiens. The guards at the drawbridge performed their inspection. They checked the first cart, opened the sacks, probed the contents. Everything looked normal. 2 oxen pulled the heavy load forward, and the cart began to rattle across the drawbridge. At the exact moment the cart passed under the portcullis at the entrance, the false peasant driving it reached behind and untied a single rope. An enormous sack, balanced on the rear tailboard, tipped over and split open. Hundreds of walnuts cascaded out of the sack and scattered across the drawbridge. They rolled everywhere, under feet, under wheels, across the planks. The driver stopped his team, waved frantically at the guards, and called for help picking them up. And the guards came. They set down their weapons and bent over, gathering walnuts off the bridge, their attention completely consumed by this trivial, harmless, perfectly ordinary little accident. In that moment, from the carts behind, Spanish soldiers emerged, helmets on, weapons drawn. The guards, crouched on the ground with handfuls of walnuts, were neutralized before they could reach their arms. The drawbridge mechanism was triggered, but the cart was blocking it. The bridge stayed down. The gate stayed open. At a prearranged signal, the main body of Spanish troops, hidden in the countryside around the city, surged forward and poured through the gap. Within minutes, nearly 700 soldiers were inside Amiens. The city fell. Walnuts. 1 sack of walnuts spilled at precisely the right second, and a city that had armed itself against every conceivable threat was taken in a matter of minutes. The Spanish held Amiens for 6 months. Then Henry IV of France arrived with a relief army and took it back. The city returned to French hands and stayed there. But the story endured, a reminder that the most impregnable fortress, the tallest walls, the deepest moats, the most vigilant guards, none of it matters if someone finds the one moment when attention wavers, the 1 second when discipline slips, the 1 instant when a guard bends down to pick up a walnut, and the world behind him changes forever.